It was great to see everyone who came up to take photos of the butterflies last night. I thought it might be quite useful if I showed you how I would edit those pictures from last night. So here we are in Lightroom, and I've picked out this picture as being one of the better ones that I took last night. The reason why I've chosen this one is if we come in, you can see that it's in focus, hopefully from top to bottom. So hopefully that will produce the best end result. So I'm in the library mode at the moment, and in the library mode of Lightroom you can see the data from the camera. So you can see that I used f11. It's quite high ISO in order to get the shutter speed of 1/60th. The reason I chose the aperture of f11 is because I didn't have anything in the background apart from sky, so I could get a greater depth of field without getting anything sort of in the background. So in order to develop, you go into the develop module, which is up here at the top here, and the first thing I tend to do is go down here to lens correction and just correct both the chromatic aberration and the profile for my particular lens, which pops up here. So then I go back to basic, and I tend to try and see what auto does. That's not so bad. I often start with auto and then I adjust after that. So it's created some very blacks in the grass, which I'll need to get rid of, and I'll start by trying to get rid of them by increasing the shadows, which has pretty much got rid of them, although I would quite like to lift this grass a little bit. So in order to do that, I'm going to go to the adjustment brush, which is up here, and I'm going to reset what the sliders are here by double clicking on the word effect, and that puts everything back in the middle, and it means I can start from scratch. So I need a little bit of exposure and a bit of shadows to try and work on that. I'm scrolling with the mouse. I'm not quite sure what you do with a Mac, but on a PC you can scroll with the mouse to make that brush bigger and smaller. And then I'm just going to paint over the areas just to try and lift it a little bit in some of these darker regions, trying not to go outside of the grass, although it does have Lightroom does have this thing over here called an auto mask, and when it's on it looks for edges, and even if you just go slightly over, it tries and prevents it. But when you've got very small bits like this, it's probably a good idea to take your brush smaller. I could do with this area being a little bit lighter, so I'm going to take a new brush. I'm going to start again, so you can see that the old brush, that's the little sort of thing that tells me, and in fact if I hover over it, it's quite useful. You can see where I've actually worked on. So I'm going to have a new one, probably same settings, but in this area I'm going to have more of an effect because it's so dark. So let's take the shadows right up and a little bit more exposure. So that pretty much sorts out my grass. And then I'm going to work on the butterfly itself. So I'm going to click done to say I finished with that. I probably could have just gone new actually. Click on the brush again, and this time what I'm looking for is a greater contrast in here, and make these colours a little bit more pop out. So I'm going to again double click on effect. I don't think I'm going to increase the exposure, but you can do it and then you can adjust later. So I'm going to pop up the contrast, pop up the texture, perhaps a little clarity, although I prefer texture to clarity, it's a new slider, and some saturation, and let's see what effect that has, because we can always add or change. And so it's just lifting it a little bit. So let's try a little of exposure, see what that does. That's quite nice, just a little bit more contrast. Dehaze often gives it a little bit brighter. No, that's probably as good as I'm going to get out of that. Sometimes I will go to the colour, which is here, and see, particularly with greens, I'll often take the saturation of greens out, which is why you can see it's left on green. For this one I'm going to see what happens if I increase the saturation of the orange. It may not be very nice because so much of this is orange and we don't want to over push it, and I think probably I don't want to touch it. No, that's probably okay. So let's say I wanted to go back to here, which I might just have a little look and see if I can get a little bit more colour in there. Let's maybe try. So you can try things and then you can put it back. If you take it down, no, I think that's probably as good as I'm going to get. And I think that's probably where I'd leave this picture. The only thing I don't like is these little bits of grass touching the edge. You might be able to get rid of this in Lightroom if you go up here. This is the spot removal, and sometimes this works well by just drawing it along there. And yes, it has done it for me. So I'll just do these two. And that one. Now that one's made a complete mess because I've obviously dragged it. So here is your history. So obviously that last one was a huge mistake. So I'll go back in my history, and that will take me to the point where I just done those two, and I'll go back and do that. And probably what I did was when I stopped, I didn't take my finger off the mouse. Now I don't like where that's taken it from, so I can actually move that, and it's still making a mess of it. That's not too bad. So if we come in and see what it looks like, it's made a bit of a mess of that, and I would probably tidy that up in Photoshop. But if you're just working with a program that's like Lightroom, that's probably good enough. Now, sometimes I'll go with the gradient tool, which is here. I probably wouldn't on this one, and darken up the edge, but it's actually reasonably dark here itself. So double click on effects so we can start for a blank canvas, take down the exposure, and you can see it's darkened there. But I think in this case that's too much, and I'm not using it at all. So we'll go back to that update spot removal, which was the last thing I did. Now, because I took it at 16,000, it's probably got a very high ISO. So coming down here, I'm going to go to detail, and in detail you can see I can sharpen it, which is already up a bit, but I'll need to take the noise reduction. Now, I don't actually do noise reduction in Lightroom. I do it with the Nik software. I use it with something called Define. But if you've only got software like Camera Raw or Elements or Lightroom, you may not have access to Nik, and that does a reasonable job. If we have a quick look, so that's the with the noise reduction on it, and this is without. When it comes, it's not huge. Oh no, it hasn't finished doing it. So yeah, you can see, you might be able to see, it depends on the quality of my video, but on my screen you can see a difference between the two. So to come zoom in like that, I just clicked with my left mouse where that hand is, and then it comes back out, or you can do it up here. So some people like to put a vignette. I don't tend to put a vignette on my nature pictures, but if you did want to put a vignette, it would be there. Well, that's not so bad. Put it too much and it looks obvious that you've done it. So that's where I would finish with that picture.